Is property investing still worth it in 2025, or is it a complete waste of your time? If you stay tuned right to the end of this video, I'm going to give away 2 of my best tips on how to become a better property investor. If you're new here to my channel, don't forget to like the video, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date with the latest in property investing. So let's face it, if you're a landlord right now, you're probably feeling the pressure from all angles. I mean, ask yourself this: when was the last time you heard anything positive about being a landlord? Essentially, we are demonised in the media as being profiteering scum of the earth, and that truly isn't what the UK needs right now. We have a complete shortage of UK rental properties in the private sector, an imbalance in supply and demand. And until the penny drops, I do think things are going to get much worse. Here are the facts. We've got higher mortgage interest rates, higher than we've experienced for a very long time. Stamp duty at a level that we've never experienced before. Compounded with Section 24, whereby owning a UK property in your own personal name is now one of the only businesses in the UK where you're actually taxed on your turnover rather than your profit. I mean, isn't that completely bonkers, just actually saying that? We've got EPC changes looming, where we're expected to take properties and get them up to a C rating. Sometimes that's even impossible to actually achieve. And to compound all of that, we've now got the Renters' Rights Bill, which, let me tell you, is more bad news for property investors. In 2023, 13% of all properties listed for sale on Rightmove were actually being sold by landlords. And then in 2024, that figure actually increased to 15% of all properties that were being sold were landlords selling off one or perhaps more of their properties. There was a poll carried out by the NRLA, the National Residential Landlords Association, whereby they asked landlords if they plan to sell any of their properties. And 41% of all landlords said that they would look to sell one or more of their properties in 2025. My prediction is that in 2025, we will see a further increase of landlords exiting the market. So what are the changes, if you are a property investor, that you need to be aware of in 2025? Well, let's go through those now, and let's start with the dreaded Renters' Rights Bill that I've mentioned. Well, currently, if you're a landlord, you're able to use an assured short-hold tenancy agreement to rent properties or rooms out to tenants on a fixed term basis. So you may agree 6 months that you'll rent the property to 1 year or perhaps 2 years. And in the Renters' Rights Bill, all fixed-term tenancies are now being abolished. So that means that the AST agreements will all be periodic, and that you won't be able to plan a period of time in which you know that you're renting to one tenant, and it's making it much more fluid for tenants to be able to come and go as they please, issue you notice and move from one property to the other without having a fixed period of time where they're tied into a contract. So if you've ever tried to evict a tenant, you will know, and most likely you've had an experience like this before, that the process can be dreadfully painful. The court systems are backlogged, you've got to get compliance absolutely spot on, and just one little thing can absolutely mess up your ability to evict a problem tenant. There are 2 ways to evict tenants. Typically you would use either Section 8, where there's rent arrears and problems and reasons why you're trying to get rid of a tenant that's perhaps a nuisance or not paying you. And then you've got Section 21, which is no fault eviction. It may be because you want to get your property back and sell it or renovate it or do something with it or move into the property. Now, under the Renters' Rights Bill, Section 21 is now being abolished. So there is no ability to evict a tenant under a no-fault eviction process. And this is going to cause inadvertently cause problems in the UK private rental sector. This Renters' Rights Bill is supposed to be making it easier for tenants to be more fluid and be able to rent properties and move from one property to another where they choose to do so. Unfortunately, what's actually going to happen is that landlords are going to realise operating in this sector is even more difficult than it was before. And so when vetting tenants at the beginning, we're going to have to be even more stringent, even more prudent to make sure that the tenants are going to pay rent, they're not going to cause a nuisance, and they're going to look after the property and be good tenants. Because if you get that vetting process wrong and you put the wrong tenant into your property, it's going to be very difficult to get them evicted. When things aren't broken and they've worked for many years, you just think, why tamper with them? And this is one of the things with the Renters' Rights Bill. I read through a lot of it and I just think, why are you changing that? Now, let me just talk to you briefly about what I do with rent increases. I'm a fair landlord. I have lots of tenants living in properties, some in rooms, some families in houses and flats. And when they've stayed for a long period of time, I try to do my very best to charge a fair market rent. I don't unnecessarily increase the rent above and beyond what's needed. And I try to be really fair. With a lot of my tenants, they're paying under market rent. They've been there for long times and long periods of time. They look after the properties. In the Renters' Right Bill, they are now making it more difficult for landlords to increase rents. And what this problem is actually going to create is, typically, if you're a good landlord and you've got some tenants and their tenancy agreement's coming to an end, you would have, or you've done a yearly review, you would speak to them and say, look, this is what you're paying, this is what the market rent is. You know, I need to make sure that we're keeping up with the pace of inflation, and we need to have a conversation about what your rental income is that you're paying. In the Renters' Rights Bill, you now need to issue what's called a Section 13 notice of rent increase. And that essentially says I'm issuing a notice to the tenant that I'm increasing your rent. What the tenant can then do is dispute the Section 13 rent increase and say that they want to go to a tribunal. And this can take, again, because where there are tribunals and courts involved, this can take a really long period of time to actually determine whether that rent increase is justified or not. Now, let's just assume it is justified, that the rent should go from £1,000 per month to £1,100 per month. During that 1 year period where you've been waiting for a tribunal to assess whether the rent increase is justified or not, you are not allowed to charge £1,100 instead of £1,000. The tenant will pay the lower rent. Once the tribunal decides after 12 months that the £1,100 is justified, you're also not allowed to backdate the rent that you've not received over that period of time waiting for a tribunal to make the decision. And that would be unfair because the tenant may be falling into arrears and those types of things. But the problem that will then happen is, after a year of waiting, you may need to do another rent increase, at which point you may have to go back to a tribunal and issue another Section 13 notice, and it's all just becoming absolutely bonkers. Now, putting aside all of the greedy landlords that might try to cheat their tenants or keep their properties in terrible conditions and not do the things that they should do, most of the landlords that I know in the circle of people that I network with are good people. They keep their properties in really good conditions. They provide great accommodation, and typically for a fair price. Landlords typically will speak to tenants on a yearly basis and agree a market rent, or perhaps slightly below market rent, on the basis that the tenant has been in the property for a prolonged period of time and looks after it. We don't excessively just jump up rents for no reason and try to make tenants pay something that's unaffordable, especially if they're looking after the property. That would be silly. If your tenant doesn't want to stay and you have to take the tenant out of the property and put a new one back in, that costs money. There's letting fees, there's new deposits, lots of compliance to change one tenant to another. So it would be silly to move someone out just because of a 50 quid difference in what you want in rent and what they want to pay. Again, things are being tinkered with in the Renters Reform Bill. What they're now doing is saying that bidding wars is unacceptable in the rental market. Now, it's not the landlord's intention to create a bidding war when they're renting a property out. That is a problem that's been caused by the disrespect of the private rental sector since 2017, when the government has slowly but surely every single year brought in a piece of legislation that makes landlords want to leave. And you've now got this system whereby we're going to be advertising properties, and if someone wants to pay more than somebody else because they really like your rental property, you're not going to be able to accept that higher offer. So inadvertently, you're most likely, landlords are going to take a bit of time to adapt to this ban on bidding wars, but you're going to get landlords starting to price their rental properties even higher to make sure that they avoid this bidding war. And that definitely wasn't the intention when they brought out the Renters' Rights Bill. Now, there's only one good thing about the Renters' Rights Bill that I can see reading the whole thing. And if you've got anything that you found that's positive, pop it in the comment section below and I'll have a look to see if I agree. But there is the implementation of a national landlords database, which I think is the only positive. And what that essentially means is that all landlords will need to provide details of their properties and details of the compliance side of things. And it's just going to create a lot more transparency. So when tenants want to look up a landlord, they can see, these are the properties that they've got, and here's all the details of the compliance, and it's professionalising the whole industry. About 10 years ago, I used to be sat in an estate agent looking after a chain of branches and giving mortgage advice to prospective buyers that were buying through the estate agency business. And whilst I was doing that, I used to have a lettings department in the estate agent that I would frequently hear them speaking to prospective tenants about renting properties. And I'll never forget, there was one very vocal lettings agent who, when he used to answer the phone and take some details down, one of the things that he kept saying over and over again, which stuck in my mind, was no debts, no pets and no smokers. And I'm not actually sure whether he even spoke to the landlords about exactly what their criteria was with renting the property, but it became this thing that he kept saying over and over again. And one of the things that the Renters' Rights Bill is now doing is bringing into place some discrimination rules. So landlords will no longer be able to advertise properties discriminating against one group or the other. So for example, you won't be able to say no pets, no smokers, no DSS tenants, that type of stuff. But what's kind of silly about the way that they're bringing that in is there's no follow through to stop landlords from actually who they pick and who they decide to let their property to. So even though you can say, I don't want to let to people that are on universal credit, it's down to the landlord to actually choose who they do decide to rent the property to. So by 2030, we're expected to make all UK rental properties meet a minimum EPC rating of a C. And this can potentially mean some very costly upgrades. If you think about certain older buildings that perhaps don't have a cavity wall, or listed buildings that have single glazed windows, perhaps if you own a flat within a building where you don't have control of what's in the roof and what's on the external brickwork, it can become very costly to increase the EPC rating to a C. So many negatives about investing in UK property in 2025. So the question really to ask yourself is, should you still continue to invest in property? And I believe that despite all of those negative factors, there are still many reasons why you should continue to buy property and invest in 2025. And some of the things that I'll mention essentially are the reasons why I decided to first start getting involved in property. Property provides a long-term wealth generation possibility that I think is unachievable in many other types of strategies. I've compared it to the stock market, to pensions, and even in some ways to building businesses. And although I don't believe in this terminology that property can provide you with passive income, because passive income implies that I'm going to sit at home and do nothing, and I'm just going to collect money. And I don't believe property can do that completely, but I believe that it can provide long-term growth in capital appreciation whilst providing you a rental income. And if you do property properly and you follow a strategy, perhaps buy, refurbish, refinance, where you're buying something massively uplifting the value of the property, either buying it below market value, or perhaps you're pushing the value up, then refinancing and pulling your money out. Or if you're into HMOs, now that's one of my strategies that I follow, which is essentially where I'll take a property that's got the right footprint in the right location, and I will force the appreciation of the property's value by doing loft conversions, rear extensions, converting it, changing the use class via planning, and then turning it into essentially a buy-to-let on steroids that will give me a long-term income for a very long period of time. Despite all of the legislation, it still can be a very profitable venture. The other thing about property, which even though interest rates are high, one of the things about property that you don't get if you're, say, investing in the stock market is the ability to leverage. So you can take a mortgage on these properties of perhaps 75% loan to value. Now, if I thought Marks and Spencer's shares were going to go up and double in the next year. If I went to a bank to try and get a loan and said, look, I think Marks and Spencer shares are going to double, can I have 75% of the value of these shares and I'll put 25% in and let's hope that they both go up and we'll take some of that risk together? I think most banks are going to laugh at me. With property, it's bricks and mortar, you've got this physical asset, and so the banks are still happy to lend, which creates a lot of value. Finally, before you go, I'm going to leave you with 2 tips which I think have helped me become a much better property investor over the last decade. Now, the first tip is that knowledge is key, and what I mean by that is that you should take property seriously. Build your knowledge. Okay, if you were a solicitor or an accountant or perhaps a financial advisor, you would be expected to demonstrate something called competency. And in the UK property sector for landlords, yes, you may have a look online and do a bit of reading of certain magazines, but how are you demonstrating that you are a competent property investor? There is a terminology known as continuing professional development, where you're building your knowledge and you're getting better. Now, how do you do that? Well, you can subscribe to various property news magazines, perhaps the NRLA or various other ones that are out there. And you can also watch YouTube videos. You can go to seminars, workshops, educational pieces that are available, and that will make you more competent as a property investor. And tip number 2 is all about networking. If you're trying to do this business as a property investor on your own, it's a lonely game. Get out there and find your local property meet. Now, I attend 2 different property meets and have done for many years. The first one, my favourite, is the Kent property meet, run by Jazz and Chrissy, and it's based in Maidstone. Lots of investors come along to the property meet and we hear talks that inspire and motivate us from various property industry experts. The second is Partners in Property, run by Adam Lawrence and Rod Turner, central London, but they've also got them all across the UK. And again, another fantastic way to network and meet other like-minded property investors and keep you at the top of your game. So that's a wrap for this video, guys. If you like the video, please hit the thumbs up and share it with any of your fellow property investors.